Hey, so we're going to go ahead and get this meeting started. This is a Lake Stevens City Council workshop meeting, and we are holding it November 1st, 2022 at 6 p.m. We are down in the mill. This workshop is being recorded and will be placed on our city YouTube channel after the recording. So with that, I am going to call this meeting to order and hand the time over to Council President Ewing for the meeting.
All right. We can go to Aaron Halverson for a department report on Public Works. Okay.
We're getting ourselves organized. Give me one more moment, please. Okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Public Works prepared a thorough report for this meeting, and there are seven topics covered in the report. First is the Grimm House timeline. You'll see on page 2 of the report, there's a timeline for bringing the Grimm House to a condition that it can be easily visited by the public and used by the Historical Society. The total cost to do this work, most of it is in-house work, is $15,100. And I know it might come as a surprise, but it can't be completed. There's just too many things to do, so it won't be completed until the end of the year. And you can see on page 3 of the report, there are 4 buckets. There are 4 different things that are happening out there. Site improvements associated with the grading and the planting, contractor improvements where that include a fence installation, and then some work on the interior wallpaper, landscaping improvements, and building improvements. Any questions on that item? Nope. Okay. We did take a look. The second item in the report is the cost savings alternatives for the decant covers and materials covers. I did spend some time and dive into it a little bit more, and you'll see there was a revised packet that came out. I had inserted the incorrect table, but the decant cover that the Public Works group proposed was a Calhoun cover. It's really a single cover across all of the bays. Operationally, it makes a lot of sense. It has a little bit more longevity, primarily in an operational aspect. It's the best option, or the better option. The return on investment of the $127,000 price tag is about 7 years, and those cost savings are realized in reduced disposal costs of sweeping and decant waste. Essentially, the waste will be drier. It will be more dry. So the city is charged by the ton. If it's wet, you pay for water, right? If we can get it dried out under these covers, we're not gonna pay for water to be disposed of. The other option is the VersaTube, which is sort of like a temporary metal garage structure, perhaps not temporary. Doesn't always have a back cover. It can. I think that water is going to find its way in at the seams. with a 10-year cost savings of $524,000. Again, you're turning the vehicles, in this model, you're turning the vehicles over pretty quickly. I think it's an interesting exercise. Our light duty fleet is around 46 vehicles. I think it's very reasonable. I suggest that it's very reasonable that the city contemplate replacing a quarter of the vehicles every year. So we have a 4 to 5 year replacement cycle. That just makes practical sense. It's disruptive to operations to have a more aggressive schedule. If you're replacing an F-150 every 2 years, they're just getting settled into it. They're just getting it equipped how they want it, and we're going to pull it away from them 2 years later. Operationally, it makes a lot more sense. So my suggestion is the city pursue the $140,000 a year option. Just operationally, like I said, it makes more sense. Any questions on that? All right. At the last meeting, there was a question about fleet useful life in that large spreadsheet that was created for our fleet management plan. I added a column for fleet useful life. I'll bring it back to you later. It's a bigger topic to discuss it, I think, than we want to do here. The fifth item is ADA compliance update. It documents that it informs you that the city received a letter from WashDOT letting us know that we have alleged non-compliance with Title II of ADA and resulting in ineligibility for FHWA funding, which is Federal Highways Authority funding. And this memo documents our response to the letter received from WashDOT. And I'll summarize it as the city is aggressively pursuing its ADA transition plan and will complete it by the end of March 2023. And that's in compliance with WashDOT's ADA transition plan that requires agencies like Lake Stevens to have their plan completed by March of 2023. So we're, I would argue, not out of compliance. And we've made that argument to WashDOT. In terms of correction of non-compliant curb ramps in the city, there's a variety of challenges. I consider some of these curb ramps are one-off. They're a $5,000 curb ramp, or we adjust an ADA button. Those are pretty quick. When you talk about curbs that they're, for instance, 18 or 25 curb ramps on grade road that need to be replaced, that's a capital project. That's not a project you do in one summer. That's a project you plan. You need to make sure you have engineering for. So as you'll see in this report, the city is tracking its efforts to address these issues. And this year, 10 ramps have been replaced and 4 new ramps were installed. Next year, the plan is to do 24 ramps replacement in 2023. And that will get us into compliance, according to WashDOT's report, into compliance with WashDOT's report by the middle of September of next year.
Aaron, just quickly, these are wheelchair ramps that are adjacent to WashDOT improvements, or
No.
how does it relate? I guess I'm wondering, how does WashDOT have any jurisdiction over what goes on in downtown Lake Stevens?
I think, do you want to take that?
Well, it's the same federal funding goes through WashDOT.
Yeah, I get that.
And so WashDOT is looking at the city's compliance because all of those are required to comply with the ADA requirements for streets, sidewalks, and so forth. So the feds look at WashDOT and see if they're enforcing their plan, which requires, WashDOT's plan requires local compliance with the ADA. And so the feds, this is the situation here where the feds have looked at WashDOT and said, hey, we've got these complaints about problems at Lake Stevens. And, are you enforcing your plan? And so WashDOT says, oh, Lake Stevens, you need to correct these things. So that's how this happened.
Well, there's numerous jurisdictions around Puget Sound that have bigger problems than Lake Stevens. And so I guess I'm wondering, why are we being singled out in?
There's been active voice in pointing out what deficiencies there are in Lake Stevens. It's, that's what it comes down to. There's been aggressive active voice pointing out ADA noncompliance in Lake Stevens, where it perhaps isn't getting pointed out in some other jurisdictions. That was one of the things we talked to WashDOT about, is that the kinds of things they're pointing out here are common. You can go to any, you can drive up to Marysville and you'll find some. You can go down to Snohomish and you'll find some. But the complaints have come in regarding Lake Stevens, so that triggers the enforcement action. And this is, WashDOT admits, this is kind of an unusual thing for them to do. There actually is no process with regard to their letter, and so how do you challenge it, we ask? Well, there really is no challenge to it formally. So rather than get into probably a tiff with the WashDOT over this, probably the better maneuver is to just speedily take care of those problems that have been pointed out, and that'll be the end of it. But that's the reason. That's why they're looking at us. Is that someone else was looking at us and pointing the finger. So that triggered this.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. So we hired an engineering firm. Is there a reason why we don't do that in-house? Come up with our own plan versus hiring an engineering firm, use our own engineer in-house and come up with our own plan to submit versus paying an engineering firm to come out and do that? I'm just curious.
It's a good, I think that's a fair question. We took a look at that to begin with. There is a lot of expertise in ADA transition plan preparation. And it's not, there is a large engineering effort as well. So each curb ramp, it might come as a surprise, each curb ramp has to be assessed, meaning every curb ramp in the city has to be visited by a technician, and a smart level has to go on that curb ramp. And we have to look at the grades to determine the extent of noncompliance. So it's thousands of hours of effort to go do this thing, and doing that in-house, we just simply don't have the expertise or resources.
Thank you.
The plans are, there's a lot of technical requirements for these ADA plans. They're not simple plans by any means. There's a lot of processes required to put them together. It probably, if nothing else, you're just not going to have the time. Your folks, this is about all they're doing.
Yes, that's true. The other element of the transition plan is we have to look at every facility and park. So it's not just curb ramps and sidewalks. It's everything that we own and open to the public.
So why wouldn't we go back to WashDOT and say, how come every city doesn't have to be the same compliance level as us?
They do.
They do. They just don't have a vociferous complaint.
I'm just saying, why wouldn't we say, okay, great, that you need to do the same thing that you're doing to us. You need to do that to Marysville. You do it to Granite Falls. You need to do it to Gold Bar.
Go visit the city of Seattle.
Right. I mean, you need to go all these places and be consistent across the board. Don't just call us out on
Go walk Washington DC Mall.
it. Right. Yeah. in there. But I mean, I don't know why we wouldn't say, hey, you got to have a consistent, you can't just call us out when every city doesn't have a transition plan the same.
Is this an issue that maybe our congressional delegation could write a letter to WashDOT and put some pressure on them?
We already have them involved.
Okay. All right. Just see, okay.
Can I just say something here? I think I get all the parameters that are going on, all the different comments that are being made. But the thing is, if we can serve the people in Lake Stevens so that they can walk safely elsewhere, I think we could have a star over our city saying we did that. Yes, it's not free, but I think we have the personnel to make this happen and to just show the way so that these other cities can say, whoa, look at Lake Stevens, they got it, why can't we? That's the way I feel about this, and that's all, I'm done.
I have a question, but not to be answered tonight. It's a topic I'd like to revisit at some point, maybe after budget's over. I'm glad to see that there's a plan to address the issues. I would like to know more about how we got here and what are we doing differently moving forward so that we don't find ourselves in this place again.
Well, there's no guarantee that we're not gonna find this in this space again because the feds keep changing the ADA rules.
Okay, so what are we doing? What do we have in place? What's the infrastructure that we're doing? What are we doing differently to stay as on top of that as we possibly can? So that moving forward, we're not sort of caught off guard.
Yeah, it's a great question, Angie. And one of the things that will come out of that plan is those steps for every project we do going forward has to meet the plan, right? And then the addition of our civil plans reviewer, that she becomes part of that planning process now of, okay, we're doing this project. Is it ADA compliant with our plan?
And that wasn't something we had
Correct.
in the past. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Do you still want to bring something back or is that good?
I mean, that's good for now.
Okay.
You can always ask in the future.
Yeah, I'll do it. Thanks.
Yeah, and Councilmember Dorset, I'd be happy to sort of walk downtown and describe the genesis of it. I think it's interesting. The
Yeah.
history of it is interesting, so I'd be happy to do it
Great.
with you anytime.
Thank you.
Okay, so we got through the ADA transition plan. In terms of ADA construction accommodation, there, again, in the memo, you'll see there are 4 key topics that WashDOT's concerned about: lack of an ADA transition plan. I'll recap their requirements. Their transition plan says that we must have a transition plan by the end of March 2023. We are going to make that deadline. That's a fact. Okay. Number 2, correction of non-compliant curb ramps. We're doing that. We're constructing those things. So number 3, ADA construction accommodation. We're training our inspectors, and we have trained our inspectors to make sure that ADA accessibility is maintained through construction sites. Constructive sites are active. They're constantly changing. So you constantly have to be moving your access around. It is somewhat simple to go take a picture of something and say, that's not compliant. If the picture is somebody moving the compliance mechanisms, that's disingenuous. Number 4, private ADA issues. The city is constantly training its staff, and I have Public Works going through a WashDOT program now, certificate program on accessibility issues. We take it seriously. It's important. I agree with you, Councilmember Dickinson, that let's be the shining star on the hill if we can.
So do you understand 3? So the example is down here on Main Street, when we did these 4 corners, even though they weren't ADA compliant, before we were starting to make them ADA compliant, while you're making them ADA compliant, you have to have routes of ADA compliance to get around your construction of making things ADA compliant that weren't ADA compliant prior to the construction.
Yep.
That was actually pretty impressive for me to say it like that.
And I,
So you're saying you're done for the night?
I was compliant. And I'm dropping the line. But those are the challenges, right? And so one of the things, especially on that project, that we recognize is we needed to do some training. We needed to train some of our folks up because we were at 80%. We weren't at 100% on what we were doing there. So training is part of it.
sure, makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, I'll end this portion with the city has an ADA transition plan webpage, website. I get that wrong. Anyway, a place people can go and view our efforts to gain compliance. And there are also some grievance forms and accommodation forms that people can use to get help if they need it or to alert the city of issues. And I encourage people to use those. Okay. Number 6, stormwater maintenance timeline for private public systems. This was an issue brought up at the last meeting. I've spoken with the stormwater program manager, and she is preparing a presentation, and you'll have that by the end of the year. And then finally, use of Department of Corrections for maintenance. The city will continue to use DOC whenever they show up, and we're happy to use them as much as possible. Any questions on the memo or the department report?
Hey, Aaron. do we
Yes.
Have data to show like what the DOC has provided, in terms of hours of labor over the years. I know during COVID, there was some limitations there, but just for context, we can kind of get an idea of what that looks like.
Sure, I'll put that in the next department report.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Aaron, did you have anything else?
I do not.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, discussion item 4, short-term rental work session. So the subcommittee came up with a draft. It went to the city attorney, and Greg, if I could ask you, Greg and I spoke about this, if you could just provide just a general input as far as the adjustments that you made that were noted in the staff report, just general adjustments that you made in your thought process.
Greg, can you pull that mic towards you a little bit more?
Up here?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. I made some suggested edits and options for inclusion in the draft ordinance. My effort was to try to tighten up some of the language. I wanted to specifically address the issue of concern about whether it's families or corporations, sort of dividing up the pie, corporations forming multiple LLCs to operate more than 1 or 2 short-term rentals. So I provided some clarity in the definitions to tighten that up and to make that a specific violation for corporations to attempt to do that. I also looked at how to make the code enforcement process less burdensome, more effective. The provisions such as the prohibiting the use of a short-term rental for parties, group sessions. I added that because one that's going to attract more vehicles. Where are the people going to park? If you're only requiring 1 additional outside space for the parking, plus it prohibits those things that could be noise generators. I know that you early on council didn't appear to be in favor of the hosting requirement.
Didn't you say that was against the law?
The hosting, no. But what I pointed out is there's some recent federal litigation where the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals held that requiring the property owner, the owner of the property to be present, violated the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. Whether that's going to be followed by the other Ninth Circuit and other circuits, I don't know. A hosting requirement has been upheld by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, which is, and the Ninth Circuit is the circuit that takes on Washington cases and that sort of thing. So the hosting requirement that's not, I don't think, in question. It seems to be a very common code provision that cities have adopted because, number one, if a host is going to be there, it's less likely that the people that are renting the space are going to violate your rules, right? And if law enforcement gets called, they've got somebody immediately that they can go to, other than just the people who are renting it. So it seems to be sort of a very favorite clause. I wrote that up. If you want to use it, you can use it. If you don't, but it's a way that can effectively make our code enforcement more efficient and hopefully less likely to be involved with the short-term rental. So basically, that was my effort in the suggestions that I made for different language for the ordinance.
Excellent, thank you. So we, I guess there were three things that were specifically called out for request previously. And so those things, the main thing that was concerned for public comment, one of the primary things was the having too many people splitting out their LLCs and using the loopholes there. And thank you, Greg, for adjusting that language. That was a significant concern. We heard from a lot of public comment. And that's one of the things that has definitely been dialed in. So I understand there's a couple of council members that have some things that they want to comments, I guess, regarding this. And if we could start either with Councilmember Frederick or Councilmember Daughtry, I don't have a preference as far as who goes first. If you could share your thoughts and input, and then we'll see if there's any other council members that have.
I'll go ahead and start with Greg. Just basically took the rug out from under me on what I wanted to actually put an amendment in. Because I was going to make the amendment that we take the waterfront residential zone and make that owner occupied. And anything outside of waterfront residential would be posted or not posted. Not owner occupied, I would say. But you're saying that we can't do.
I'm not saying you can't, okay?
You're saying it's being litigated.
I'm saying it's become an issue. It's become an issue. It hasn't gotten itself up here to the West Coast, Washington State yet. There are a number of cities in Washington that have put in the owner occupied requirement, whether that's going to get challenged and whether the Fifth Circuit's determination of the violation of the Commerce Clause is going to be adopted in this circuit or not. I don't know the answer to the question. I just pointed that case out because it is a significant case, and whether that's a trend or what's coming up on the horizon out here, I don't know. It's too early to tell. I mean, certainly adding that provision now, there's no case law that says that you can't do that yet. So
then I would like to make the friendly amendment that we put in that it is required to be owner occupied on waterfront residentials in that zone. And outside of that zone, it doesn't have to be owner occupied, and it goes by the language we already have written.
So can you, so that's a new topic. Can you just elaborate on your thought process, how you arrived at that?
Well, the reason I arrived at it is we have most of the conversation around this whole thing for the past several months has been owner occupied. A lot of our input from the citizens, some of who are here again, are adamant about having owner occupancy on waterfront. If they're going to have something on next door to them as a VRBO or a short-term rental, we get everything right. VRBO is not a short-term rental. It doesn't meet the 30-day thing. So we have precedents in waterfront residential zoning where we have different language in the codes for waterfront residential than we have every place else. There are other zones in the city. There's precedents to do that. I mean, they pay a different stormwater fee on their taxes. There's all kinds of different things that we have, and the waterfront residential is different than other places, just based on the fact that it's waterfront. I mean, there's regulations that are on for the water that we have that are different than there are from my backyard, for instance. So there's precedents for doing that. And so I just think that it would be a way of explaining the difference of being able to have having people happy with how the code is written for the different zones. And I believe that it would work. So that's my friendly amendment to what we're doing, is waterfront residential, owner occupied, every place else, what we have written here.
All right, so Kim's made a suggestion. Thank you for that. Comments from the rest of the council?
I don't necessarily think dividing up something for a waterfront residential group versus the rest of the community is a good idea. Because then is it always something different for people on the lake versus the whole community? I think the whole community is what's in play here, not just the people around the lake. And when you isolate one group out and say these people can have a certain set of codes and then the rest of the community's got to abide by a different set of codes, I think that starts to set a bad precedence.
Okay, thank you.
I completely agree, and I'm just gonna leave it at one community around the lake. That's supposed to be the goal. And I think it's a challenge when you start parsing these things out. And there is a precedent, and I don't know that precedent in many ways is a good one. You know, when we start prioritizing or putting in special exemptions or protections around a certain class of people, then we by default create classes. We start treating people differently. And I don't know that that's the direction we really want to go. That being said, I also listened to all of the public comment, and I think there's other things that can be done. What I really hear, and I agree that there's been a lot of conversation around owner occupied versus non-owner occupied. But I think what people have generally voiced is a concern about their property, about their safety, about their noise level, about how these things are licensed and operated. And I think, to me, I think those are the larger concerns. And I think there's things that can be put in place in the draft ordinance that address those. But since you put forward the new amendment, I think everybody else needs to weigh in before we talk about those other items. But there are 3 or 4 other points that I do want to bring up.
Okay, so we'll touch on his first, and then Councilor will give you your time to bring up whatever thoughts you have. Councilor Jorstad, what are your thoughts on the amendment?
I concur with Councilman Frederick and Tangent. I'm not in favor of separate ordinances for separate properties in our city.
Okay, Councilmember Dickinson.
I also agree. I do understand that lake properties are more challenged because people want to party there. I get that. The truth is, we are one city around the lake. So I believe it's really, really important that we serve all our citizens. Sorry.
I just, we don't know that. I think that's an assumption, and I think that's a concern, and that's a fear, but I don't think that's a fact. I think we need to stay with the facts that we know.
As far as I know, the facts say that we've never had a real incident from what the group has said. Is that
The last
correct?
staff report said specifically there was 0 correlation between reports and the short-term rentals that are known.
And it also indicated the last reports were in 2020, so I did not see any data for 2021 or 2022 included in that, but there's indication as far as code enforcement concerns. Councilmember Peter Shigan.
It probably comes no surprise to anybody sitting up here that I would support Councilmember Daughtry's amendment. We're not talking about a specific class of people. We're talking about a zoning code. If you want to make things all the same, let's get rid of the zoning code and have everything the same. Again, we're not talking about a specific class of people. We're talking about property in the zoning code that goes with that and what's allowed with them. Those particular items, commercial property is different than residential. Neighborhood business is different than industrial. They have different set of criteria for each of those classifications. What Councilmember Daughtry is recommending or advising, I believe, is an amendment to the waterfront residential zoning classification, not the class of people that live there. So I would support his amendment. I would also ask Councilmember Ewan, you touched on one of the 3 items that you were bringing back to.
The other 2 was the calling out the specific codes in there as far as the violations. To put those languages, Councilmember Frederick asked for that, and our city attorney's done a nice job of incorporating that, the specific code into the ordinance itself.
Such as noise.
Correct.
What's the third?
Third one is we failed to put the good neighbor guidelines. There were not specific items in there. And those, that was an oversight on the part of the committee. And those have been, the new draft has information there. So those are the three items that were asked for specifically. And then there were some other things that, as Greg touched on, that were added that were not specifically asked for. And we can touch on this later. Councilman Fritter.
I was just gonna add, we call them the good neighbor rules, but I think specifically in the RCW, that section of code is actually titled the consumer safety section. Where it lists the need for contacts and all of those things that needs to be provided to each renter.
Yeah, we're not limited in terms of the good neighbor
Right.
requirements. So those things that are in the RCW, obviously those are things you're going to want so that the state in those statute is looking for the safety of the people there. They know who to contact for if there's a problem. Our good neighbor policy can be broader than that in terms of addressing the rules for things like
Absolutely.
noise, our own code provisions. So I think the way it's written or drafted now in the ordinance allows for that we can set up the good neighbor requirements to include both the state stuff and our stuff. So that's made known then to the renter. And that needs to be posted and available to them while they're there.
That would be like the city ordinance, like after a certain time at night, they're required to not have a certain noise level or.
Well, there's the quiet time thing.
Right.
The code provision. So, but having those things in the policy posted at the short-term rental place.
And that essentially puts them on notice as
Yeah.
to what times. Is that the point? Is that what the group thought? It puts them on notice that, hey, here's the times you're supposed to be quiet around the lake. Here's
Here's the gas shut off, here's the power shut off, here's who to contact. Yes,
Right.
it's those essential items for them to know the safety of themselves in the building.
All right, so Councilmember Daughtry, there are at least four. I said I am in agreement with the majority as far as the having something that applies universally absent data that shows something to the contrary. So it looks like that motion is not going to move forward. Councilmember Frederick, you had something you wanted to, at least one item.
Well, a couple items. And again, what I hear consistently is concerns about safety, concerns that there are going to be large developments that are overrun with short-term rentals. And I apologize. And I actually talked to Russ just before the meeting, and the last point about the control of just the physical numbers of short-term rentals in the city. I didn't have a chance to send out an email to anyone prior to the meeting, but I asked for clarification on a specific clause in the short-term rental code 1, which is 9(9)(bi), which says a short-term rental does not include any of the following: a dwelling unit that is occupied by the owner for at least 6 months during the calendar year in which fewer than 3 rooms are rented at any time. Just to understand how that is mitigated effectively. The second point, just to get them all out there and out of the way so that we don't take up everyone's time. There needs to be, one of the things that we didn't talk about, and again, it came out of public comment, the absence of penalties. And there are penalties that can be applied. One is in the RCW. And specifically tied to what we're calling the good neighborhoods. And that's a civil class 2 infraction after a second offense. And what's interesting about it's written is there's no timeline to resetting the clock on those offenses. Once you have been notified the first time by a letter from the city attorney, each time subsequent, it's a civil 2 infraction. As I read it, and certainly Greg can correct me if I'm wrong, because he's the lawyer. But Russ also mentioned that he did have a chance to follow up on that conversation, and that we actually have some stronger infraction capacity within our own code. So I would certainly suggest that we identify that in this draft ordinance, so it's clear to everyone who puts in an application to get licensed to operate this, that if you don't comply with these rules, if you allow tenants to misbehave, that there are monetary consequences for you, up to and including your license being revoked. The other thing that is called out in the RCW that we didn't identify, and I don't believe it was identified even in the original ordinance, was specifically the requirement for liability insurance, which goes to the concerns about property. So there's a requirement for $1 million, minimum $1 million policy liability coverage for these properties in the RCW. So I think that needs to be called out as well. But the last thing, just a general concern, the overwhelming concern, and again, we don't have the data to support it. We've talked about that. And that's not a flaw against anyone. We never anticipated needing a system to track short-term rentals in existence in the city. But there are things that have been put in place in other cities to basically control the number of short-term rentals that are permitted within that municipality. And it's most commonly done by tying the number of allowances or requirements to either occupied or owner occupied to the percentage of available housing units in the city. Most notably, that's done in Bellingham. So those are other options that we really haven't discussed. And I'm not clear if that sort of option was discussed as an alternative to a clear outright thou shalt be owner occupied. But there are ways to limit the number of short-term rentals, to have stronger teeth in the policy and not necessarily require an owner occupied clause in the rules. So I throw all of that out there. That's all of my verbal vomit of a week's worth of research, and I will leave it at that.
I want to press pause on that, and Russ, if I can have you talk about the piece there about the enforcement component of the first piece that you.
Yeah, the enforcement piece.
Because I think that's an important piece. If you can share maybe what you shared with Sean for the group here, so we can understand what that would look like.
Absolutely. So as you reference towards the end of the ordinance, there's a section on penalties and enforcement, and it references chapter 17, I believe 1720 of our municipal code. That's our code enforcement process. Within that, there's a section on penalties, and a civil infraction under our penalty schedule would be $250 for the violation. If there are repeat violations, that could be up to $250 per day that the violation continues. The other code section that I discussed with Councilmember Frederick was also from our business license code. So in chapter 404, that deals with business licenses. The penalty process in that, you could levy up to $1,000 fine for someone who has not followed the business license protocol. So we do have a couple of penalty mechanisms. Most commonly, we would go to chapter 1720 because that encompasses the entire municipal code, but there could be other violations that could compound on that. So we do have a procedure in place that had been brought to my attention. So we did do some research. David included that in your packet, that he looked at a lot of other jurisdictions, how their penalties worked. And really what we've sort of described already is pretty common with the other cities, that there's a revocation policy, and then most of them point back to their own municipal codes for an enforcement process and assignment of penalties.
Thank you. Any questions for us based on that part as far as the penalties go? Any comments or discussion about Sean's proposal regarding the penalty portion of that?
Just if I can step back, one question for Russ. On a business license application, is not an inspection required?
No, it doesn't
No?
have to be.
Okay, thank you.
So what would the proposed penalty be for someone like, I'm all for all these short-term rentals to get licensed. What would, say someone's operating without that?
I think the base penalty is the $250, but that we could assess up to the $1,000.
So the process would be someone operates a short-term rental, maybe doesn't know, the city gets in contact and say, hey, you didn't have a license to operate this.
Yeah.
They come into compliance, they don't get the fine, but if they do not come into compliance, then we can levy up to $1,000.
Sure.
Well, actually, they would probably be notified in the notice of violation that they are operating without the required license. That they have until this date to come in and get it. If they continue operating, it's $250 a day from the date that they got their notice, because that's what our code, so it could be much more than if you really had the bad person. It could amount to several $1,000s if they're really delaying coming in to get the license.
But it is a progressive enforcement process, as you described. There would be a warning. We'd ask for voluntary compliance. If we don't receive that, then as Greg mentioned, we would go to a notice of violation and start the process of levying any penalties.
So Sean, are you proposing that that be put under subsection as far as the enforcement part and adding that's somewhere there's 4 items that are noted currently in the current draft. Are you recommending that some either a 5th item or updated language of one of those 4 items to better type that in?
Yeah, I think it needs to be called out. I'll leave it to the code writers to write it in the most appropriate way. Language matters, and writing code is a skill set. So,
okay.
Well, you've got two things going on here to help. One, you got the code that allows the city to take particular action that we're going to use, our people have to use if in the event of a violation. And then you've got the notice to the short-term rental operator owner that they're aware of what the penalties can be. That doesn't need to be in the code. That can be in the licensing documents that are given to them, that here's you're required to comply with these. If you don't, then you can pinpoint the violation. The way the code is written right now is it allows the city code enforcement people to use all those tools that we have in our code, and to use the consumer safety statute in RCW 6437 that Sean mentioned. So the code currently has all those allowances in it. And maybe the more important thing is to make sure that we have and give adequate notice and warning to those people that operate the short-term rentals, that if you don't comply, this is the actions and the possible penalties that can be assessed against you. So there's kind of 2 directions.
And I would direct council to page 20 of your packet, subsection E1. The language in there does say complaints and enforcement are subject to the processes identified in chapter 1720 Lake Stevens Municipal Code, including any fines and penalties imposed for substantiated violation. So I would suggest that the language is already there that gives us the authority and references the applicable code section to do that work.
Although we could reference the business license.
Yes,
section
we
for
could
terms of-
include that as well,
I think that would.
in addition to chapter 404 of the business license.
Right.
code.
Councilmember Frederick, would you be willing to tighten up the language of a operator? The way it's proposed right now is a tenant can also be defined as a operator and has the ability to offer or provide short-term rentals. So getting back to this point of contact, I guess, would it be appropriate if we just had the word or the definition of an operator is any person who is the owner of the dwelling unit? I envision you maybe issuing a fine to a tenant who's offered a short-term rental where that tenant really doesn't care.
The owner is
Well-
always the responsible
Yeah.
party.
Well, where that
Yeah.
language comes from to address is the issue comes up as to whether someone who has a long-term lease on a house and their rental contract, lease contract with the owner of the property allows them to sublease or to let, the issue comes up, can that person be the operator of a short-term rental? This language recognizes that they could do that, as well as the owner of the property, that someone with a long-term lease who wants to sublease their property and who's allowed to do that about their own lease can go ahead and do it. That's the reason for that language, is that it clarifies.
Well, and I appreciate the reason for it. I don't know as though that's appropriate.
Well, that's a policy question.
It
Sure,
still
I'm
goes
just saying,
back to the owner, though.
I'm just
If the
saying.
owner has an agreement with the, what are you pointing at?
I was just, as far as Russ though, as far as if we're talking about monetary fines and so forth, you end up fining a tenant because they're the one that sublet that property on a short-term rental. Is the enforcement mechanism really there?
Well, the tenant is gonna need to come in and get a license to
Right.
do that.
Right.
So the tenant needs to come in, get the license to operate it. The owner may have given them. And if for some reason they don't, and then the owner gets fined, that's a lawsuit for them and the tenant who's running it to be part of.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's just the operator that's going to define whether that's the owner of the property or a tenant who gets licensed to run the short-term rental at the property.
Could we pivot back? I got two. I wanna make
Well-
sure. Go ahead, Sean.
I was, let me answer the question. I don't think that I would be against tightening up the language at all. I think everything that I've proposed is an attempt to tighten up the language. But now I want to ask a broader question. Yeah, I'm going to ask the question. Do we want to allow long-term lessees to sublet as short-term rentals? Or is that something that as a city we could stop?
Kind of gets back to the LLC argument, doesn't it?
I don't know about that. I mean, to Sean's point, I mean, the concern is that we have people that are, a renter is typically going to, this is generalization, so they're generally gonna not take as good care of their property, and that's the suggestion here with hosted versus unhosted. That are we going to allow someone to sublease all of that? And that's a fair question. Can we pivot back? to the
Yes,
other 2
we can
points?
pivot
That's-
back.
That's point number 4 for you. I want to make sure we go in order. And
Reached
so we
your
can
limit,
follow.
But I have a fifth.
Okay. So we have a hard cutoff at midnight, just so you know. Liability insurance, Russ, where would, I guess we don't need to call that out now. Is there anyone that objects to that being added?
I think it's already, I think it's already in the ordinance because it references the need to follow the appropriate RCW that requires that, but I agree to call it out, to put it in, to make it implicit, makes sense to me.
Okay, Russ, do we have that?
Yeah, we can add that
Call that
in,
out specifically.
Yep.
Um,
probably in section D.
D. And, all right, so limit of number of units in the city. So that is something that had not been considered previously. And I see Lake Chelan is one that has their different sections that they have called out. That have some of the units that are allowed, based on their zoning. What is the thought of the council to Sean's proposal there?
Was it proposed at 2
per owner.
per owner?
No, I understood it to limit the number of units
Total per
period in the
city.
city.
Right, how many
Right.
licenses?
Cap the number of licenses in the
Yes.
city, which I guess if we're going to, I want to pause there and say, Kim, I agree with what you said there. If there's data support, I am more than willing to revisit this. If a year down the road, we find that we totally missed the mark and lakefront residential is a primary issue, I'm absolutely willing to revisit that. So I don't want to think that, hey, we're just going to leave this and not adjust it if we need to. The limited number of units in the city.
I don't think I'm for that. I feel like we have 0 lodging options right now. There's no hotels. We don't even have a 28 unit hotel. We have maybe 28 units that are out there that we can track or do. If the number was 500, I might have more concerns. But right now we have approximately under 50. If we were to expand that, I don't see how that correlates to housing options and choices for whether it be a traveling nurse or a family that wants to be here in town or doing whatever. I'd probably not be for limiting the amount of.
Well, where it comes from is the problems that some of the municipalities are having with people coming in and buying up properties and only allowing them to be short-term rentals. If you have somebody that has a basement that's been finished out for a traveling nurse for 90 days, that's totally different than when you're looking at a property that was bought solely for the purpose of turning it into a short-term rental. And if they keep buying them up, which is that they're having problems in Bellingham and other places, Chelan is another one, if they keep buying them up just for that, then your housing stock goes down. For the rest of, for everybody else.
Yeah, but corporations are coming in buying houses and turning them into rentals.
But that's
So when you talk
long-term
about-
rental, and that you still got people that are actually getting something out of the long-term rental. So there's a slight difference there. Because,
I just don't think we have that issue here.
no, that what it's really trying to do is make sure we don't get the issue.
So if
Get
you're
out
the
in front of it,
29th
that's
person
what
that
this
wants
whole
one,
thing's
you
all
don't
about.
get to use the property the way you want to use it.
You know what, I know both that I stand the same way you do on that. That I think property rights are a big deal, but we also have people that like to skirt the differences in some of the ways that you do their property, and that's where the problems come in. So I'm starting to think that getting out ahead of this, like other municipalities are doing, is the best thing to do. That it isn't uncommon for the municipalities that we're talking that have been looked at, they're having huge problems with short-term rentals. And the housing stock is one of those that's gonna be a problem. And, I understand it. We've got corporations that are coming in and buying houses for long-term rentals. Long-term rentals is totally different than short-term rental. I mean, the profitability is more for the corporation. I get that. But I don't even, there's so many things that go on with property acquisitions and things that are really above my pay grade. And I don't really understand them, especially as much as you do. I understand that. But I still think that the short-term rental becomes a problem long before the long-term rentals.
Okay. Either Angie?
I am in favor of a short-term rental cap. I don't know. I think there's more discussion to be had about how we determine that. And maybe that's something that where we have the ordinance in place and we get a monthly report about how many licenses have been granted. We kind of see what that, how quickly that number is going, and we make a decision then. But I am in favor primarily to just to speak to what Councilman Daughtry said, to preserve the housing stock that we have and to ensure that.
Okay, so 2 parts. So are you in favor of adding that to the current draft of the code, or are you wanting to pass that and then add that as a code amendment? time to be determined and have that reviewed for.
I don't feel like I have enough information or data to pick a number at this point. But I am in favor of implementing.
Okay.
Yeah.
30.
Councilmember Barry?
I'm just listening.
Well, we'd like your input.
Oh, my input.
Yes.
Well, I believe
As
the
far as
cap,
a cap on the number of.
I think
total
the cap
units.
is a very good idea.
Okay. And Councilmember Gary,
No comment,
no comment?
no comment,
Do you have a position on that?
no comment.
Councilmember Daughtry, so you're in favor of a cap or no favor?
I don't have enough information. I'd
Okay,
like to see what other municipalities are doing,
okay,
where they're deriving their information from, where their formulas are that determines that.
so we will, I think there is value in that, evaluating that more. So Russ, if we can put that on some kind of docket, either planning commission or future, that we can have that and have that be a discussion point going forward.
Not as part of this current ordinance, but as a future revision and a
Correct.
deeper dive.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's something that can be looked at, and we can do some of that work. And you know, I will say I saw an eye roll when I mentioned from the audience, when I mentioned my position about revisiting things. We have another ordinance that we've missed the mark on, and it's going to be revisited likely here next year. And I think the council is open to trying to do the right thing, and we don't have all the answers. We're doing the best we can with the information we have. We want to do the right thing. And so if we miss the mark, that we're going to come back and correct it. So thank you, council, for your input on that. Subleasing. The question came from Councilmember Frederick about a long-term renter subleasing theirs as a short-term rental. What's the council's thought on that?
I'm not in favor of a somewhat arrangement where a tenant would then become able to have a short-term rental of the property that they don't own.
Okay. Mary, you're nodding yes, so you can.
I agree.
Okay. Any other council members want to weigh in on that?
I would agree with that.
I agree.
Okay, I'm also in the fifth, so we have Russ and Greg. Is there a way that we can incorporate that provision in, that there's no subleasing of a long-term renter?
It's just a change to the definition. It's just
Whatever,
striking out some language.
whatever you
so-
want to, what do you want to do with the?
We
with the
take out the
definition?
language that kind of, that Gary's referenced, and we.
Can we memorialize that Gary and I disagreed on something?
Disagreed or agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Just what?
We're gonna pause.
Okay,
Okay, so thank you, Sean, for those, for that input. Is there any other input as far as?
The one thing that's missing, and it's been touched on already, there does need to be a review of this, because part of the reason why this is so challenging is simply a lack of data on what's actually happening in the city. So this needs to be reviewed next year. And we need to identify what's the data that we need to review this effectively in terms of complaints or police activity or property damage or whatever those things are, to feed back into the process to make sure that this ordinance, if adopted, is effective. And if it's not effective, that we can identify why to make it right.
I like the idea of reviewing it, but I was gonna say maybe 2 years versus a 1 year. That way we're not bringing the same topic up year after year after year. I think let's give it a couple years worth of data versus 1 year worth of data. Let's give ourselves a couple years to see how it works out. If something massive is going on, then we can call this in at any time. But I think instead of trying to review it after one, why don't we go for two, get a better skill set of data to work off of.
So one of the things I think we ought to add into this is, I don't know, I might be wrong on this, but is there a provision here where we have to, if there's going to be a business license for a short-term rental, that we have to notify everyone within 300 feet?
No, it was determined to be a type 1. So there's no
Okay, so
Noticing
should we add the
requirement.
language into this code that make us do it that way anyway?
Yeah, that could be, it would be a type 2 permit, and then that would give public notice if that's the council's desire.
Is that the only difference between a type 1 and a type 2?
Essentially, yeah.
Okay, so here's my reasoning on this. How do the people that are living next door to a short-term rental gonna know? And also know what the recourse is for when they have problems? Who do they call? So I would think that if we're going to reach out to people within 300 feet of the property to tell them that the possibility is there's gonna be a short-term rental there, that we'd also tell them what the procedures are for code violations, or what they think is a code violation or a concern, who do they reach out to? So I think that needs to be something that we do. It's a communicative type thing. I know type 1s require it, or I mean, type 2s require it. That's great. And so if it has to be a type 2, then I suggest we take it to a type 2.
Let me present a different scenario. I'm not totally disagreeing with you. Just want to put that out there, but I worry that if the notification goes out to a neighbor and that neighbor is strongly opposed to having short-term rentals, and they know that there's one next to them, but they potentially might be on the phone every night, calling the police, calling to complain, calling the city, drumming up sort of a paper trail to make their case that short-term rentals don't belong in Lake Stevens.
Okay, so chief, how do you handle somebody who's a chronic complainer?
We would track it and then we would file what the complaint was, whether there's a violation or not. It would be with the clearance code, so we could tell if there was a violation or not.
So I agree with what you're saying there. I don't like that to happen either. However, I think that whoever's called, code enforcement or the police, if they're called to the scene, they're gonna make a determination whether it's really a problem with that or not. And they're gonna advise the person that called whether they're right or not.
I also don't like the fact of telling everyone within 300 yards, feet, whatever, that my house might be vacant more often than not. So that way, if it goes into the wrong hands of the wrong neighbor, they can come and vandalize the house. They might know that someone left and they could break into the house. So you're letting everyone effectively know that more often than not, that the home will be vacant. I don't know that I necessarily would want my neighbors knowing that I'm gonna be there or not there. I don't broadcast if I'm on vacation or if I'm out of the house, that I want everyone to know that it's not. Furthermore, if someone had concerns about it being, they should be able to look it up in the public record that they have a license to operate a short-term rental there.
How would one do that, Russ? Look up
Look
under
it
the
up.
public record to see if somebody has a business license
They
for a
they would
short-term
send
rental.
Kelly a nice email and say, I would like all the property information on this property, including business licenses, et cetera. So we do have a process, and on our website, a portal to make such requests.
It seemed to me to be fair to the neighbors, kind of a heads up that the commercial operation is going to take place on a piece of property, that at least it would identify, if there is a problem, a recourse or a contact for that neighbor to maybe have. Maybe there's something nefarious going on in the property and the property owner doesn't know about it. At least, a heads up to them or something. Are you aware?
Is the recourse different if it's a short-term rental versus a neighbor that's a problem? I mean, I've,
You got people coming and going.
yeah, I mean, I think that happens,
That doesn't happen in every neighborhood.
but it
You don't have
happens,
people
but it
coming and
happens in
going.
houses that aren't short-term rentals. Right? So you have people coming and going, or you have noise problems, or you have parties, or you have, whatever. You're gonna call the city, you're gonna call police, you're gonna call code enforcement, regardless of whether it's a neighbor that's not being a good neighbor or it's a short-term rental, right?
People call all the time about dogs barking at night or some
I know, it was-
kids who are partying too late at
It would
night.
seem to me if there's a problem in a house, at least I would probably investigate it a little bit. If there's no point of contact, who do I call? I mean, the person that's occupying the property says, flake off. What do I do? So I call the police immediately? It
Yeah,
just seems like there would
absolutely.
be hopefully a relationship with the property owner that you could say, hey, John, or whatever.
I just don't think every neighborhood, I don't think that's the
Well,
norm
maybe-
anymore.
Well, it does in our neighborhood. So I don't know what neighborhood you live in, but
I live in Lake Stevens.
no comment.
All right, so we have two voices that oppose that, two in favor. Sean, what's your thought?
I'm not opposed, but I think the 300 feet is a bit arbitrary because we don't live in a city with uniform size lots.
Well, that's one of the reasons I just took it to the same one we do for other type twos.
No, I'm not challenging that.
And the other thing is, you look at some of the properties where we're doing infills and things like that, it actually encompasses any of that. Any neighbor that might end up behind you that wasn't there before, for instance, you're telling everybody in a 300-foot radius, and I think it picks up everybody that would need to know. That's why I use 300, because it's in the code already, and
I can live with it's in the code already. I certainly don't want to make things complicated. I was going to ask if you would consider adjacent properties specifically to cover those properties that surround. But I do recognize that if that's already in the code, that certainly covers the same gamut, but likely more.
Well, this is a type 1 use. We would be changing it to a type 2. is that
Right.
correct?
So I can point out a couple of things, just so I'll make a distinction between one of the planning commission's recommendations and what you're talking about right now, and sort of this type 2 process. So type 2 process for noticing is 300 feet or 10 properties, whichever is more. So I want to make sure I'm adding that, because as you are correct, not all properties are uniform. And so there's sort of a caveat to catch that. The planning commission recommended notice to adjacent properties or something to that effect. I'd have to go back to look to the earlier drafts, but that is something that they talked about, which is kind of a tweener. And that's something that Dave just mentioned as well, that maybe we could do a hybrid, keep it a type 1, and at the time of application, provide the good neighbor documentation with the point of contact or something like that to adjacent neighbors or neighbors in a radius. So I think there is some latitude if you wanted to create a new process and keep it totally administrative, but that was, I do believe, one of the original recommendations.
Okay.
I'm fine with adjacent. I don't have any
Well,
no qualms with adjacent or 300. That's not the point. The point is communicating to
Right.
people that there's a way of doing recourse.
So the tweener? His term, not mine.
It's technical.
All right, Mary?
I agree with Councilmember Frederick. The tweener sounds like the way to go.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding the tweener. So I have that adjacent property owner. So what does that look like? Every property that abuts up to the proposed short-term rental, is that what you are intending? If it's a type 2, or we can still do a type 1 and add that provision that each adjacent property.
Can we be simple with this? 300 feet. What the current code is, you guys are debating this for 20 minutes. I don't mean to disrespect it, but we're talking about this for 20 minutes when we have in the code 300 feet
Still with the
or 10 houses, whichever's greater. Let's go with
So
that.
that means if I have one, I have to go, if they're all right next door to each other, I have to go down to 10 homes and let them know my personal business. I'm not for that.
I'm not talking about what you guys are talking about. I'm talking about, stop talking about 300 feet or 10 houses. It's in the code. Let's just go with it. It's simple. It's easy.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
So we are at, so we're making the adjustment from type 1 to type 2. Is that? So at least four in favor of that. All right, so it's now a type 2. Kim, did you have anything else you wanted to? No. Gary? John? All right, Mary,
No.
Angie,
Okay.
Marcus?
No.
So I had a couple things here that were different than the original text, and I just wanted to bring up. One was the last item, E4. New short-term rental will not be issued to the owner, operator of revoked short-term rental permit and business license until 2 years from the time of revocation of passed. The original language there was 1. And my thought on that is all of us, many of us have encountered bad tenants or bad situations where we've encountered. I think it's unduly punitive to someone should they get a bad tenant. 2 years, but I want to know the thoughts of the council as far as changing it from 2 years to 1 year.
My preference is 1 year.
1 year, just so I understand.
If your license is revoked, you can't apply for a new license from 1 year at the time of revocation versus 2 years.
I would vote for 1.
I would as well.
1 year. Okay, so we've got at least 5 for 1 year.
I'm okay.
So at least 6. So if we can make that Russ to the E1. So the language from D3 was adjusted from the original text from the subcommittee. And I'm proposing that it be reverted back to, and I believe it's actually the same language that the planning commission utilized, was no short-term rental can be rented for residential occupancy by more than 8 total individuals at any time. In the language there, I mean, the draft ordinance, I think, is, calls out who can stay in what bedroom and what age and things. Just seems, I'm not sure what prompted that, but I don't think that's necessary. And nor is it enforceable.
Well, yeah, this language is an attempt to address the issue that was brought up earlier about discrimination from familial units to families. That is that you may have a couple, there's 1 bedroom in the rental and they've got a 6-month-old child or a 2-year-old child. They can't stay there because they have this child. So this language was an attempt to address that issue to allow, if it's a young child, they can easily stay in the same bedroom with their parent. We're not prohibiting those people from doing the short-term rental. So that's the reason for that language.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I think, okay, then I will strike my recommendation. Thank you for that, Greg. The last piece there is on D3. Excuse me. Excuse me, B3 was included in that. No short-term rentals must not include weddings, banquets, parties, charitable fundraising, other gatherings for direct or indirect compensation. And so that language was, I believe, included with the Planning Commission's recommendation. And I don't know that about the enforceability of that, based on parking and other requirements that are in place. So I want to know what the council's thoughts are on that. Was what your thoughts are on striking B3?
No.
I have a clarifying question. Is the emphasis on is the intent that there should be no gatherings for direct or indirect compensation? Or is the intent that there are no weddings, banquets, parties, charitable fundraising?
Well, it's all implicit. So what, how are you gonna decide what a party is? For example,
I guess what's the direct or indirect compensation? What's the point of that phrase?
Well, there are often people do things at their homes or properties where they're going to sell stuff. Or you have an art dealer, I'm going to rent this property and I'm going to have paintings set up. People come to the place and purchase this or glass or wood, whatever. There's all sorts of different things that people, I can't do this at my house, but I'll do it at this house because it's bigger and it's got.
Okay,
So the intent, basically, the intent of that language was to keep the purpose of the short-term rental as simply to provide accommodation, a place for people to stay, not to do things like at graduation parties, those kinds of things that generally cause short-term problems with short-term rentals in terms of a neighborhood where they become loud and lots of people.
so this language would also not allow a graduation party,
Right.
regardless of whether
Right.
there was direct or
Right,
indirect compensation.
exactly, yes,
You couldn't have a birthday party there. You couldn't have 7 people over and have a birthday party.
right.
That seems a little ridiculous to me.
okay, so Angie, what are your thoughts?
I am in favor of not allowing activities, gatherings for compensation, but I would agree, I guess. If you have a family in town for high school graduation and you want to have a graduation party, I don't think that's our place to say no.
And you have all the rules that enforce it. If they're being loud after hours, that's what the nuisance is there for. But to say I can't have 7 people over to have a birthday party because it's classified a birthday gathering or whatever you want to say, I don't understand that, but not for people being compensated short-term rentals and renting the place out.
Okay, so Mary,
I'm just wondering about how many people we'd be talking about. If we're talking about 7 people, or we're talking about a wedding or something like that.
Well, there's parking regulations, so you
Right.
can't.
Right,
you have to
exactly.
Follow the regulations for parking and the regulations for noise, and
Mhm, gotcha.
so I guess, I mean, you could have a wedding with 7 people.
True.
So I don't think we can define what types of gatherings people can have. I think we need to say you have to follow the rules.
Gotcha.
and I think the intent of what the D3 that was added, it said no short-term rental can be used or occupied. So that's the mechanism that was been added to preclude that from happening. So, the neighbor that's notified and say, hey, there are, counting and say, hey, there's now a 9th person there. And they would be able to, that would then result in, action. So.
I think if the language where the intent of short-term rentals is to provide transient accommodations and gatherings for direct or indirect compensation are not allowed, then that addresses the compensation piece and the intent of the rental without defining what a gathering looks like.
Correct, but we still have, with the D3, still limits, cannot be used or occupied by more than 8 total individuals. That was added. That was not part of the subcommittee. That was added for the most recent last week.
Mhm.
So that with that language there, it means no more than 8 people on the property at any time for a short-term rental. As I read it. So we've got 2 folks, actually 3 that are saying or no direct or indirect compensation. Sean, what's your?
Yeah, I would support the no direct compensation piece. And I also think there's already some existing language. The short-term rentals excludes charitable organizations and things. There's something in there about charitable organizations already. So I don't know that that necessarily needs to be called out. I'm certainly not against it. But I think there's probably a simpler way to address the language. I think we just say that the purpose of this is for accommodation. And then we clarify from that point on.
So like Angie's comment, the intent of short-term rentals is to provide transit accommodations. There will be no gatherings or whatever language for direct or indirect compensation. Because they're capping the number of people that are allowed at the residence at 8. Based on what we have with D3.
I think we actually, I don't know, Greg, there's a separate RCW for transient accommodations that specifically defines RCW 7062, identifies transient accommodations, mean any facility such as a hotel, motel, condominium, resort, or any other facility that places offering 3 or more lodging units to travelers or transient guests. That same RCW specifically identifies those accommodations as something separate than short-term rentals.
What was that statute again?
7062 210,
7.62?
7062 210.
So we should adjust the term there, I guess, is the
Yeah.
takeaway from transient to
Yeah.
short-term lodging or short-term rental, to keep it consistent.
Thank you for.
Yeah, well, that definition is specific to this particular chapter of the code, but we could certainly revise our section.
Just to avoid future confusion.
Okay, so with that, are there any concerns with the language there that the intent of short-term rental is to provide transient or short-term lodging? There'd be no gatherings for direct or indirect compensation. But we can strike the other language. Russ, would you please summarize for us the council's recommendations?
Yes, I will try. We kind of jumped around a little bit.
You get one try.
Okay. So starting with the definitions section, we're going to do some additional work in the definition to remove the reference to tenants. I will also point out there's a typo in the definition, and we will take care of that at the same time. As we talk about the section B3, we're going to propose language that says something to the effect of the intent of short-term rentals is to provide lodging of less than 30 days and does not include gatherings for direct compensation.
You want to include indirect as well?
There was some debate on that. So what's the flavor of direct and indirect?
I'm in favor of direct and indirect. I mean, I think we just eliminate the compensation piece, that there's some some kind of quid pro quo or something that's there, or, in kind activity, then that would be included.
So is that both? Let's see, just.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The decision was to maintain the suggested modifications to D3 to include recognition of children and a household total. In section D6, I would propose to add a clause to the last section. So it reads, the short-term rental must comply with chapter 6437 RCW and add a clause that says something to the effect of including insurance requirements. As we get to complaints and enforcement under section E1. We would add a reference to the business license code 404 in addition to 1720. As we move on to section E4, there would be a change from 2 years to 1 year. And there was also discussion that the council would like to revisit this in the future and have us do some research on caps. And there wasn't a decision if we should revisit in 1 or 2 years.
Correct. Are you, is the council satisfied with that summary?
Oh, and a biggie, a type 2 application process.
Yes.
Okay, which Mayor helped us out there with, or else we'd still be talking about that. All right, thank you for that discussion. Lots of good input. Special thanks to Kim and Sean for your input tonight. We can pivot to.
Before we move on from that, so this comes back up on the 15th. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's a public hearing.
Yeah.
Here's my concern. If we bring that back on the 15th without, because although we've had 7 great minds go over this, that's been translated over to an attorney, a community development director, and a code writer, and they've got to put that together. And my concern is if we don't have a workshop before that public hearing, before this is brought to a public hearing, and that you guys can go yes or no or yes with these things. I don't want to run into the same problem that we had last week where we showed up with we thought we had it and we didn't have it. I want to make sure we have it. So, and I don't see staff being able to get your changes done before next Tuesday, which would be the next time that we could maybe look at it. So just some thoughts there of how long it's going to take staff to make these changes. And then we want to make sure it gets to the council so that you can be comfortable with it, so that we can then take it to public hearing.
I think the changes are minimal and that, and I'm going to speak for Dave and he can speak to this, but we would probably be able to have these revisions to look at on the 8th. I know that everybody has wanted to keep the 8th a short meeting. They could definitely be available on the 15th. It just would, for due process, we would need to continue the hearing from the 15th if we don't have the hearing that night to a date certain.
Okay, so if it's council's wishes, I'm hearing from staff that we can get you a good cut on this on the 8th. You take a look at it. It just may mean that that evening goes a little longer and you can't look at your phones at vote returns during the meeting. And then we would be able to keep the current schedule if we're okay with that.
How long are we trying to keep the meeting on the 8th?
Really short.
Like 30 minutes short, 2 hours short?
No, like 30 minutes max hour.
That is the first public hearing for the budget. That might be a little longer than a half an hour.
I'm trying to go 30 minutes to an hour.
That would be a.
Okay. So we're all north and south on this, that plan? Okay.
North and south.
North and south. Okay. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you, council.
All right, thank you to staff for their help with this, and hopefully we can get that dialed in. So we will excuse the audience. We're going into executive session to discuss collective bargaining, no action to follow.
Hey, Council President, if I can add
Are you going to be able?
also potential litigation, we actually have 3 topics for you, but they fall under collective bargaining and potential litigation.
And how
And
much
staff
time?
is asking for 20 minutes to start.
Okay.
Tonight.
Got it, midnight.
Okay, we are back on.
Yeah.
Okay, we're back on.
We're back on track. Yep.
All right, back from executive section, there's no action to follow. Go to Director Halverson for the enterprise fleet contract discussion.
Okay, thank you, Council President Ewing. I did mention this earlier in the meeting this evening, that the city is contemplating a enterprise lease agreement for our light duty vehicles. I did give you the incorrect number. There are 36 light duty vehicles. We did return to you with 3 scenarios: the $140,000 a year scenario, $175,000 a year scenario, and $210,000 a year scenario. My recommendation is the lighter scenario, the $140,000 option, and that will give us a 4-year replacement cycle. You can see those model runs in the packet. The savings again is a bit lower for the 4-year replacement cycle, but it aligns better with operations and disruptions that come with constantly replacing vehicles. And the final page is the draft master equity lease agreement. The way this works is the council approves authorizes the mayor to sign the agreement. The city executes the agreement and you control it with budget. So if the council budgets $140,000 for light duty fleet replacement, we work within that budget, right? That's how that would work. So we have a standing agreement. We don't amend the agreement. You don't get, there's no selection of vehicles. The council sets the budget. They hold the purse strings. The administration deals with the logistics. Are there any questions on that? I will add to that. The reason I'm bringing this back now is this is relevant to the budget. And so a decision needs to be made. Director Stevenson would love to have a decision, some direction as to how the city is going to deal with this matter. So we're looking for that.
I appreciate you coming forth with the different scenarios and justifying the scenario that you feel like would work best operationally. I'm fully in support of moving forward with the $140,000 a year agreement.
Okay, Marcus.
Yep.
Mary.
As well.
All right, Sean.
Agreed.
Okay, all right, so we have Barb,
A head nod.
you've got majority of the council that has head nodded for that, for the $140,000 fleet. So Aaron, you don't get to choose your family, is that what I understand?
It's true.
Okay. All right, Barb. Aaron, are you done with that?
I'm all done. Thank you.
Okay. Barb, if we go to resolution 2022-15.
Post, will you enable my screen participation?
I suppose.
Yes, I would like you all to know she gave me 3 minutes to do this.
At 4 to 4.5.
Yay. You're gonna- Hey, Kelly, can you get the clock up?
Yeah. All right, let's go. Let's see how far we can get through this. Okay, so procurement policy. Last time we had this in front of council was in 2018 when we actually drafted the policy, and then we brought it back once for for an adjustment. So the purpose of the comprehensive procurement policy, it implements the requirements of state and federal procurement laws. It provides fair forum for bidding on public contracts. Oh, wait, hang on.
Can you share it?
Hang on. I did, but, oh, there we go. Sorry. Here you go. Okay, here we go. Yep. Okay. So, and then an insurance contract performance. So it helps us to ensure that public contracts are performed satisfactorily and at the least cost to the public while avoiding fraud and favoritism, and helps to streamline the transactions through consistent use of the policy, and then management flexibility when it comes to approval processes. So the substantive policy revisions as were in your council packet, mayor and city administrator approval limits, we did increase those from 100,000 to 250,000. This again, everything in the policy is if it is budgeted through council. So if purchasers under contracts are outside of the budget, they will come back to council for budget amendments and approvals. So anything budgeted expenditures under 250,000 would no longer come to city council for additional approval unless the mayor or city administrator chose to bring that forward to you for additional look at it or additional review. Department heads have been delegated authority to sign contracts within certain limits. That includes under their, they need to be budgeted under their signature authority, which is the 50,000. They're limited to 1-year contracts, and then the exclusions are interlocal agreements and then bonds and grants, which have to be signed by the mayor or city administrator. Directors are also will have the authority to delegate their purchase limits to staff via written delegation to finance. So this really helps when some of the departments have purchasers. Police department has kind of a purchaser and the public works has a purchaser. So this will help with them signing off and making the purchases. The limited small works roster process for the contracts under 35,000, that was mistakenly removed during one of the prior updates and is just being added back in. And then the reporting requirement of budgeted expenditures, we did remove that based on conversations with council. So this is if it's budgeted and it's under, if it goes over $10,000, we came back to council and said, hey, we went and did this thing that you already approved us of doing. So we did remove that from the policy. Purchase threshold, so we did increase the direct selection purchase thresholds from $15,000 to $50,000. So we don't need to go forward to get additional bids and quotes for anything under that dollar amount. As we continue moving forward with our purchasing and our contracts, that dollar amount seems smaller and smaller every year. So informal procedures, those have increased from 15,000 to 150,000 to 50,000 to 250, which again is the mayor and city administrator's limit. The last one I have on here is other services. We separated those out from architectural and engineering, and we're not legally required to solicit bids for other services, and that's personal services and purchase services. Those are things like accountants and attorneys and consultants and HVAC. So we're only required to do bidding for engineering and architecture because we're a code city on over 20,000. So council makes our own rules and policies on that. So we did remove the required procurement procedures and thresholds, and then they are still listed at those same amounts as the purchases, just as recommendations. And then we did make an exclusion that the mayor and city administrator may require bidding in line with those recommendations, should there be a specific contract that they want us to go out to bid for. This is looking at a comparison between our current prior version of the procurement policy and then the proposed. Everything in red is the updated changes. I did make a couple additional changes in here. I didn't have the department approval amounts at the under 50,000 listed in a couple of them. And so again, this is just increasing the thresholds for mayor and city administrator approval, and then moving the council's approval up to that $250,000 versus the 100 and 150 that it was at previously. Everything is still the same when it comes to qualification-based information for the architectural and engineering. And then we did go ahead and add the federal guidelines. And so when there's any federal funds involved, we have to use the stricter of the guidelines, whether that's federal or state or our own. And so we just kind of say, go see the threshold above if you have to use ours, or here's the federal side. Some other policy revisions, city administrator change order approval threshold, we increased from the $100,000 to the $250,000. Controlled commodities, those are like IT subscription based purchases, and that threshold was also increased to the $250,000. At that point, there's a competitive negotiation they're able to do. It's just another form of bidding or RFP process. And then there's a number of non-substantive changes we made. I just thought I would recognize those, adding documentation requirements. What's required when you solicit or obtain phone quotes, cooperative purchasing and small works rosters both require a list of the cooperative purchases contracts that we've made through the year and the small works rosters we made through the year. We also added value purchasing criteria, so that's the highest score. Instead of when the bids do come in, if we can look at the highest score based on preset criteria versus lowest bidder all the time. And then contract review, we updated to only require additional legal or risk management review if standard contract templates are not used. So we already have templates in place that the attorneys have already approved to form, and our risk manager has already looked at them for insurance purposes. So if it's something outside of that, then they need to look at that. There was also some definition updates and some website references that were updated. So that's the only thing I have in here. Do we have any questions or concerns regarding any of the threshold changes or any of the authorization changes?
I do have a question. Definition of within the budget. Is this the amount budgeted to the department, or is it a line item budgeted to the department?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The question is definition of within the budget.
Mhm.
Is it the amount budgeted to the department, or is it a line item budgeted to the department?
Amount budgeted to the department.
Okay, so they can come up with something that they need, change their line items to reflect the amount of the budget that was budgeted to them, and do something other than what they had planned on doing.
Yes, based on the conversations that we had previously regarding whether it's this piece of equipment or that piece of equipment. yes, it's within
That's
their
what I
budget.
intended.
Yes.
I think that's what we've been working on a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
Give them their budget, let it work within it.
Yep.
All right, so you're gonna put that on consent,
We will put that on consent next week.
all right?
That's
All
exciting.
right,
Thanks, Barb.
item C, Barb, budget amendment
How many
#2.
minutes did I have?
It was a little more than 4, but you did good.
Wait, who's that?
Let me get to the next one. Hang on a
Aw,
second. I'm working. I'm
oh,
working.
that's cute.
Is she done with her 3 minutes?
Hey, you went over. Barb.
Aw,
You
I
went
know.
over.
That's the dog we know. I don't know. Who's dog?
Okay, budget amendment #2. How many minutes do I have on this one? 3.5. Oh, man. Okay, so this is the budget amendment for the 2022 budget. So this is our second amendment to the budget. This kind of compiles everything that we've done throughout the year, everything that council has seen, any last minute changes we need to make before the end of the year. This just takes a look at all of the budget, or all of the funds that are actually being amended, and only lists those that are included in the second budget amendment. This is a look at our summary of the budget amendment itself. So we had our original budget, we had our first budget amendment that increased the resources and the expenditures. The second budget amendment, the revenue adjustments, the majority of those are resources, are interfund transfers, fund changes, approved grants, and the accounting for the mitigation credits, traffic mitigation credits that we've done for the 24th 91st project. There's a potential that we need to actually account for the funding coming in and going out, even though it's a credit. So we're just working on that. So there's a correlating expenditure to that revenue source as well. So that is in there. And then interfund transfers for the staffing and operating expenses that were approved for the pandemic recovery funds. So those are when, and I'll show it a little bit later also, and I think I had something in your packet showing like staffing that was surface water only. We're actually taking the funds and putting them into the surface water fund, so those can be funded for the next few years. IT stuff, it gets actually moved forward into that IT fund, so we don't have to keep coming back into the original fund for it. So this is in your packet, various amendments. This is, so we had donations for the police department that you guys have seen and accepted through the year. So we have those revenues and those expenditures budgeted. We have the mayors and business leaders for public safety. That was, the mayor talked about that in October. Then we had docket processing fees. Those were included. I don't even have a date on that. Those were included earlier this year as well. The North Cove restroom repairs, we did have a budget amount for that, so we wanted to increase that budget. We did receive some insurance revenues back for that that are in here somewhere. And then we have the mill capital, the wireless audio system for the mill that was approved in June. Took us a little while to get them. I believe they're coming. Permit capital, Bluebeam software, it was originally budgeted in the pandemic recovery fund. It has been sitting in this fund, available to be spent since the early in the year. And then there was a SR 9204 welcome sign that was discussed in June of this year. And then the 20th Street Phase 2 construction project, there were some punch list items from 2021 that were paid for in 2022. And then surface water billing fees to Snohomish County, there was an increased number of parcels and costs. And so that's just a small increase to that fund. We just want to capture the expenditures so that we don't go over expenses. This is the grouped operational amendment details. The first 2 lines, that's a grant that accounts for the climate pledge grant, so revenues and expenditures. The next 5 line items, that's your law enforcement equipment capital fund, and that's for the movement of funds for the body worn cameras, the increase in the cost for the 2022 vehicles, and the budgeting of the vehicle replacements for 2023. So all of that was previously discussed as well. And then the last portion of the pandemic recovery accounts that I had talked about, as you can see, the first line is transferring funds out of the 004 fund. And then the next 3, all the rest of the lines. The next one is general funds, the money going into the general fund, which is capturing salaries and benefits for the funded positions there, including the risk manager, and a few others. And then the 410 fund, as I mentioned, there's a couple positions that were approved that funding is going into 410. And then the IT, which are going into the IT replacement and renewal fund. So that's just moving the funding into those funds to be utilized for the next 3 years. And then your capital amendments, the first 4 is for Eagle Ridge. We're actually just moving the funding from the REIT 1 to the more restricted REIT 2 fund. And additionally, the grant and expenditure amounts have been updated for the CIP. We had originally had a higher dollar amount for the grant revenues, and those have actually been reduced. I think I didn't reduce it on this one. And then the additional funding for Eagle Ridge remains in the pandemic recovery fund. So there is still more funding out there for Eagle Ridge. This is just moving what was in REIT 1 into REIT 2. And then, as I mentioned, that 24th, 91st, it's just accounting for the traffic mitigation payment and credit, depending on how we have to account for that. So it's just an accounting reporting issue. Let's take a look at the amended organizational chart. Some of the things that occurred, there were some that were just reclassifications. Surface water management coordinator to surface water coordinator, that was brought forward in July. Engineering tech to surface water specialist, and then the engineering tech, storm field tech to surface water. So a lot of just reclassifications, retitling, those all came forward in July. And then we also had the movement of all the parks people under the park director. And then we had some IT support specialists to support analyst, and the network administrator to system engineer, and that was in June. So just accounting for everything that the council has already looked at and approved. As I mentioned, there's your reclassifications for surface water and IT, and then the supervisor division changes for the Parks Department, and also for Public Works, as the city engineer now supervises the capital project manager and the capital project inspector. Are there any questions on that? Just basically capturing everything that's been happening over the last, well, the last budget amendment we did was in April, so.
All right. Does that conclude C, item C? Or
What is item C?
budget amendment 2.
That is the budget amendment. Yes.
So you have
On
nothing
the
to add.
agenda items. Item C is budget amendment. Right, is that what you're
I
saying?
don't have it in front of me, so. I
Oh,
can't-
okay.
I can bring it up. Item agenda C, yes, that is included.
Okay, just want to make sure you're done with
Yes,
that. You were
thank
done
you.
with that item, and we could move on to, Brett, did you want to take this? You want Barb to?
Barb can start out.
Okay, with the preliminary budget and discussion.
Okay, so I put together some slides for council discussion tonight. So just a reminder, we have the first public hearing next Tuesday, along with the property tax levy ordinance that will be coming forward next week as well. So some discussion items, fleet management program, I did just add the 140 in here as that was already discussed. So I will get that into the budget recommendation. I know another item that council was discussing was the decant facility and material covers. I believe Director Halverson did add some alternative cost information in there. So I know that was an item you guys wanted to discuss. And so this is all council discussion. These are just kind of points that we have noted throughout that were of interest. So does anybody want any additional information on this or?
Yes, the purpose of this slide is just generate discussion on these items that we thought were brought out from y'all.
It's already touched on the fleet management. We've included that. So the decant facility material covers.
I have a question for Aaron. Why shouldn't we go with the VersaTube option?
Great question.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I touched on it earlier. Operationally, the VersaTube is, quite frankly, it's flimsy. It's really more of a residential use.
And you said it has a two-year life?
No, it has the company claims a 20-year life. Yeah.
I believe the 2-year was return on investment.
Return on
thank you.
investment is
Okay.
2 years.
Thank you.
Yeah, for cost savings. It is more of a residential storage type structure. This yard has heavier equipment in it, loaders and excavators and backhoes and so forth. So it's something we can make it work. You know, it's going to take some more repair. It's not going to be as watertight, airtight as the Calhoun option. But it's, you know, you asked me to bring back an option. It's a lower cost option. It's just more of a residential type option.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's helpful. Thank you.
And I know he had pictures of the two options in the packet as well.
So Aaron, talking about that, when you have on your charts that you showed us before, you had the ROI. And the ROI you had in there was 7-year ROI on the Calhoun and 2.5 years on the VersaTube. So I assumed that would be that we would be reversed, that we would be changing out the VersaTube every 2.5 years.
No, it's just a return on investment. So how much are we going to save on disposal of waste once these are in place before we start getting our money back, or
Okay,
they pay for themselves?
I get it.
Yeah.
I went down the wrong tube.
Well, I will also add that the Calhoun structure, if you look at the photos, you can see it's got a metal structure beneath the tarp, the heavy duty tarp. I'm told that metal substructure is very robust and will last several tarp life cycles. Their tarp life cycle is 25 years. And so, you know, you're going to go out and replace the tarp with the VersaTube. You're probably going to have something that looks like a tornado might have been nearby. If that makes sense.
Looking for direction.
Yes.
Gary? I did. In light of what we're dealing with in the budget, I don't see any reason why we can afford the Calhoun.
That's not me, Troy. Whatever's happening up there. I believe I have the
And-
internet on.
All right, Kim.
I was like, let me make sure I don't have.
I agree.
anything going on. Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, I agree.
Sean? Carrie? All right, so we have at least 4 head nods for the VersaTube. All right,
Okay, first two.
yes.
Okay, and then some other ones we were kind of looking at. Is this? Oh, there it is. Hang on. Okay, and then I didn't know if there was any additional ones you guys wanted to discuss, and so I had the list here that does allocate it by fund. I know there was some question regarding allocation. If there was anything else specific in here, or if not, we can just move on.
Hearing none, let's move on.
Do you want to move on?
Yep.
And if there was no questions on capital projects, those were my next couple slides. So if you don't have any additional questions or anything on those, we will move on to wage discussion points. I know this is a big one. Looking at the compensation study, this is currently what is in the recommended budget. It's estimated at $470,000, and I do have to split out by how that funding affects the individual funds, looking general fund, street fund, stormwater, and then the other is permit revenue, and that's just based on work done by individuals in the other funds for permits. And then the cost of living adjustment, as Director Warrenton had mentioned, the guild non-commissioned is at 3%, guild commissioned is it backwards? Guild commission is at 3% and non-commissioned is at 4%. Sorry, so backwards. But we do have the 8.6% in there, the 90% CPI, approximately 515,000. General fund is about 385 of that.
All right, what's, Gary, you want to start with your thoughts on the compensation to 60% as far as your thoughts on that? Are you agreeing with that? Or are you wanting to table that, or wanting tiered implementation, or what are your thoughts on that?
I guess just a question of general knowledge. Of the people that are in their positions, don't they typically, I mean, we're talking about the starting salary for that particular class, right?
Salary survey is based off the midpoint of the range.
I guess I mean, most of our employees graduate to higher levels of proficiency, right? In the sense that they move up the chain.
We have 7 steps in each range, if that's what you're asking. Every year they go up a step until their 7th year, or if they're hired in at a higher step, then they'll, like if they're hired in at step 5, they would only have 2 ranges to go to the top.
2 steps.
Because we're hiring everybody in at higher steps right now. Right? Everyone we're bringing in at the highest start, a step below the highest. So that way they
And the
jump
existing or
work that have spent a longer time working their way up.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is after the 7th step, within their range, they no longer get steps, they only get cost of living after that 7th step.
So the compensation study designed to address that lack of wage increase.
Yeah, raise that floor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what it pulls out is that imbalance of doing 90% for the last 10 years. And then now you're only at step 7. And then you don't have, then it creates that imbalance within those funds.
I don't know, as I see the need for it, but at the same time, we do have limited funds as to what we can allocate. And so how do you balance that out? This is a tough one. I appreciate bringing everybody up to a level, but at the same time, what can we afford?
Well, see that, what can we cut?
Well, it doesn't appear we can cut anything.
There's capital projects and those kind of things we cut.
Right.
What if we keep cutting capital projects? We keep having people in the community more frustrated with us, right? We're not doing sidewalks, we're not doing different projects and so forth. So, I mean,
Wheelchair ramps.
right, we're on notice.
Man, honestly, I don't know. I'd like to hear from other folks.
All right, Marcus, what's your thought?
My concerns are more of the people that we've had for, I don't know, 7 to, I don't know, 12 years or something like that. Those people who have been working their way in the steps. Meanwhile, everyone's jumping in and they're jumping right into a higher step. These people feel underappreciated, would be my guess. And for me, I look at those people saying, okay, we gotta do something to get them caught up. The people who got in at the higher steps, not that I don't care about them, but I feel like they already got in at a higher compensation. We've changed job titles to bring those people in. So I can see doing something more for that middle group that are well below, get them caught up to the 16th percentile or whatever we feel appropriate. And we look at those budget numbers and then look at the cost of living allowances.
Well, those are the numbers right there, bringing those 51 employees up to the floor, right? Or 49 or whatever it is.
And what this is the years in position method, which is kind of what Mark, what Councilmember Taji was talking about, is that it will affect the people that have been here longer in their positions because they're going to get the larger increases, whereas the people that have just started the city that are at year one their range will be updated to reflect the market. However, they will go to the first step in the range.
But the cumulative total is the 470,000
Yes.
hit. Right.
With
So,
that method.
Yeah, with that method. So
And that's because the positions were so below the market. So even at putting, I think I shared the statistic last time, I can bring back up with several people staying at step one with this implementation method.
I mean, I think we had I thought a really good discussion about which method. And I think the years in position for all of us, it seemed like that was kind of the different ways to approach this. That was the best way. My concern, if we don't act on the compensation study, is that it then becomes, it's no longer relevant after a certain period of time, right? It's not based on actual numbers. And so then it becomes a waste of money and a waste of the time that was put into doing the study. And I think
back further.
And they fall back further, right? I think I said this earlier, I think following the guidance of the compensation study that we invested money to undertake makes sense, and to bring everybody to the fore. It feels really hard and potentially financially not possible to do both the compensation study and the cost of living adjustment at 8.6%. So I'd like to propose that we focus on the cost of living adjustment and how we want to address that issue and agree to the compensation study, bringing everybody level, but then how do we look at maybe a tiered cost of living adjustment, or do we postpone it for 3 months or 6 months, kind of see what happens with the economy? Do we do 2% for the first of the year and consider 5% July 1? I don't know.
So Angie's made a proposal that we pivot to the cost of living and see where that sits. I mean, I can see the value if we decide that we're going to do the compensation study. Then then we pivot to the amount and figure out how we want to do that for the COLA. Are we okay? I mean, I guess I'd like to hear from others to see where we're at with the compensation study. If we have the board majority says, hey, let's do that, then let's pivot to the COLA and see what we're going to do there. Sean?
I would agree in the importance of looking at the 60th percentile and having more conversation around the cost of living. I think the challenge here is that in both cases, I think we're looking at challenges sustainability. And there's a really simple solution in year one. We obviously have the slide show up, but we have a list here in our packet of all of the proposed new positions. At this point, it's an academic exercise. If we want to move forward with the compensation study, we need to find somewhere to cut. If we cut in capital projects, that comes with negative consequences. Then we need to make some hard priorities on some of these positions that we want to bring on as an offset. That's sort of the framing hammer solution to it. but that is a straightforward way to free up the space to offset the cost of implementing this year one. Ultimately, we've got to address the revenue issue. So that's agreement. That's the long way to say, yes, I agree with Angie.
I agree that we need to look at maybe positions that we're bringing on this year and look to see if there's positions that we can hold out.
So let's hold off on that topic and just focus on the compensation. So I've got two saying yes, let's do the 60 percentile fully funded. Mary, what's your?
Well, yeah, I'm thinking of cost of living and I'm thinking of another topic that we're going to talk about, affordable housing. We do want people that work here to be able to live here. And whatever it takes for that to happen, but at the same time, where's the money going to come from? I mean, I get this. So I would say what Angie said, I would agree with her 100%. And I just keep thinking of folks that I know are homeless. I know we're seeing more homeless people.
Okay.
So that's how I feel.
I stated mine last week. I think we should do the compensation package 60 at the 60 percentile level with the years in service. And COLA is a separate conversation.
Okay, so I hear a majority of the council is in favor of the compensation at the 60th percentile and full with no adjustments. Is that? Are we in agreement? Head nods.
Yes.
Okay, so let's pivot to the COLA.
I want to just echo what Councilman Frederick said. I think the conversation about the COLA is also a conversation about added positions. I don't think we can make a decision about that without looking at the positions being proposed, and
I'm not prepared to talk about it until we see the positions.
And I do have that.
Okay, so okay. So, go to the positions. I have a different take on it. I think that the COLA, contrary to what some think, will be utilized, whatever we set for that. What I don't want to have is disparity and say, hey, these non-rep people are worth 8.6, our police and our public works who are in the trenches, hey, we're only gonna give you 3%. That 5.6% is going to be a slap in the face to those staff. And so I think having some measure of equity, at least in year one, to like reset that table is appropriate. So let's, the council wants to pivot to the position. So let's move there. What's the council's take on that?
So a couple of things on this, just to give some food for thought is, if I had to prioritize the new positions, they would be in support of our public works accreditation and making sure that we're setting up our public works for success in their processes. They would be the public works analyst, because part of that job is going to be making sure that ViewWorks is adhered to and worked throughout the public works, and that's a vital, critical function of our public works accreditation, and making sure that we're functioning like a normal modern day city. The second one would be the IT position, application analyst. The reason being is that's the IT guru side of the ViewWorks, right? Making sure that the background of it all is the application is functioning, and it's not just ViewWorks, but it's obviously other applications, but they will have that under their purview. The third priority would be the quartermaster spot, and I think that we will see savings, organization, and efficiency through that spot. And then the fourth position, which is an add, is the park ranger. The park ranger one, at this point, we could go either way on it. I think we could table that one and collect some data over this next year to help either support or say no to it next year. So the park ranger one, I could field a card away on that one.
All right. Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor, can I ask about the seasonals? Was that?
Yeah, but the key there is the seasonals, right? And the thing about seasonals is I think we have 4 seasonal spots on the park.
Is that what we're asking?
Yeah,
for?
and I think we actually have, we have 2 in the base budget and then we added 1 additional
Right.
for the request.
So the key there with the season, I would ask is, it's kind of like the police officers. If we had 8 show up, we got the word for them, right? And so I'd ask for some leeway with the seasonal workers. If we had enough people who wanted to do seasonal work in our parks and make sure that they're up and running and we're able to use them, I'd ask for some leeway there.
All right, so it's great to talk about priorities. But there's also another piece of it, and that is when during the year
do they come in?
Could you, I mean, the priorities of those 4 could be January. What about March, April, May? Bringing another priority in. So really, I think that what I'm looking at, I mean, if we talk about the COLA and trying to say a COLA at 3% in the beginning, and then look at it 6 months later and say, okay, we're gonna have another 1 because the economy's doing good, better. It's the same conversation with the priorities of who we're hiring, right? The economy's doing better. Let's go ahead and slide.
Park ranger in or
slide the grant writer in there, which I think is a priority, by the way.
Yeah.
That gets to what Councilman Frederick was talking about is, bring more revenues in. Who's going to do that better than a grant writer? Or raising taxes, which that's not,
And Kim, if I may, I was remiss on talking about the grant writer. That's something we're still studying, right? Like, what is it? Is it an FTE? Is it a contract? Is it?
Well, I understand.
And I forgot to add.
I understand that, but it's still, I think it's up there in the priorities. If you're gonna have priorities, it's probably number 5.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe it's number 1.
It's probably higher than that. I would agree. In fact,
But if you look at it and you say, we have all these positions that we've talked about and basically agreed to these positions for 2023, then those are your, let's say, 5 priorities. Now, what's the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th priority? And is there a method where we could go looking at it at, let's say we're looking at it every 2 months? And do we add 1 or 2? Or we can add 1 or 2 based on what the economy's doing. That's my only point is, can we look at this as a sliding scale on both the COLA or just this? You're going to get savings. If we hire all of them in January, it's a lot of money all in January, but you're going to get savings if you don't hire somebody till the end of the year.
Yeah.
So
We really spending almost $500,000 on a compensation study? $467,000?
That's not a study, that's what the cost is, that's an increase of the revenue.
Oh, okay,
Based on
okay,
that.
gotcha.
That's okay. I want to be.
I was wondering when I signed that
That
one.
was the wrong line of work.
Sultan LLC.
So we need to go back to that one where we talk about who can sign what.
Right, exactly.
I think that I need a little more time to prioritize this and look at it.
I wonder if it makes sense for Mayor, for you, given this information, for you to come back and kind of look at the positions and provide, I think, just what you're talking about, based on like what priorities are January hires, what hires could be July hires, what could be potentially October hires.
Well, I can tell you right now, but the 2 priorities would be the application analyst and the public works analyst, because we're getting ViewWorks up and running now.
When you say 2 priorities, like January priorities.
January. I think that the one you could push off is, well, and then also the grant writer, as soon as we figure out what that is, I think we need to get going on that one. And then, quartermaster, I'm not sure where that would fall within the year with what we're working on. I'd have to think about that one. But the park ranger, like I said, I think we could hold off on the park ranger, get some data this next year on parks and maybe revisit next year.
Well, I agree with Angie. I think what we would like to hear is you come back and tell us the entire program.
Okay. We know.
I mean, just discussing it right now is not really,
A tier.
you need to think it out. You need to talk to your directors. You need to figure out what the priorities are when and what that's going to do to the overall city.
Yeah.
And then come back and tell us what you think that is. And
Okay, so I'll work on that, and then I'll as well, how about if I revisit the COLA and we'll kind of drill down on that a little bit more.
Well,
Come
but
back.
I tend to agree with what Councilmember Ewing said is everything should, when the tides raise all ships, they all ought to raise the same way.
Yeah.
So COLA should be across the board, police are gonna get this, everybody's gonna get the same.
Yeah.
That's what I think. Now, I could be convinced differently with some data.
So just so we know, we do the non-rep every year, correct? And so we do the cost of living adjustment each year for that. So depending on what the outcome is of the guild and the other things, say, hey, well, this is what these folks are getting. Let's have some parity in that. I don't like the idea of having three classes of people, one getting 8, one getting 6, one getting 4, whatever that is. Because of it just, the optics of that are terrible. And so, yeah, I just don't like the optics of that at all.
Yeah, we can come back with that.
We're not talking about classes of people, we're talking about zoning.
Too soon, too soon. Too soon.
Yeah, it was still raw.
That got me right here. So then you had thought of the COLA. I mean, I guess we want to make sure we're giving you enough. Anyone else want to make a comment on the COLA or their thoughts on that? So
No, I actually, I completely agree with everything Councilmember Daughtry had to say. I think it's spot on.
Well, but I heard from Councilman, correct me. What I heard from
George,
Kim is that you're good for a full COLA. Did I miss that? No,
I didn't say.
you're
that.
looking for some kind of incremental.
I'm good. If you come up with an incremental, like Angie had suggested, an incremental.
Okay.
COLA, if that's the way it works, but I think it ought to be what Councilmember Ewing saying, all votes the same.
Yeah, I don't understand the boat ships thing.
Okay, everybody gets, the non-compensate or the non,
Navy versus Army.
Everyone gets the same boots.
yeah, everybody.
Okay, all right, I got
Except
that.
you.
Not
I
maybe.
get really
Different
cool.
for you.
I get cab boots.
I will just remind everyone that is a little difficult to do with the union contracts, as they're not the same now.
Right.
So the Teamsters and
They're
and
never gonna
guild
be the
aren't-
same.
Right.
because
And
they're
even the
never
two
gonna be
guilds aren't the
But-
same.
wildly different, like double or triple is not.
Right.
Is not.
Yeah.
something-
And I am not arguing that either.
I understand because bargained at the time of the bargaining and we don't even do the guild until next year. I understand that, but it's like he's, 8.6 for this and 3 for this. Yeah, that's a non-starter.
I'll come
It was a
back.
starter. We just,
Yeah.
we want some additional input. It was definitely a starter.
All right, Barb, what else got?
That's pretty much it. As I said, we kind of talked about the park ranger versus the seasonals and the quartermaster. Yeah, so I guess we will finalize something for next week's public hearing. So that what's coming out in the public hearing will be the mayor's proposed budget to council and get some continued discussions there. Or hopefully you guys say, yes, perfect, that was great. Move on, move ahead.
Was there anything else that we missed on the budget discussion that we tied up?
Not for me.
That's all I have.
All right, Gary.
Yeah, I was asked to give a report on the Affordable Housing Alliance, which is a group that provides statistics and information about subsidized housing, not affordable housing, in my opinion. Gentleman by the name of Chris Colliers is the chair, I guess, or the employee. And Angie asked that I give a report on it. The first part of the year was spent, there was a meeting in February and March. March was actually canceled in April. And the first part of the year was discussing Chris Collier's compensation. He was being wooed by Pierce County. And there wasn't a lot that went on other than that discussion. He ultimately got a pay raise, which was funded by the Everett Housing Authority. And the Everett Housing Authority, I think they probably pay about 70 or 75% of the entire budget for the affordable housing allowance. We spend, I think, Russ, correct me, $4,300, $4,375 for our little participation. I don't know if it's worth arguing about. I don't see the value that comes out of this organization. There is, I haven't seen anyone on the committee that actually builds anything. It's elected officials and staff people. The topic is subsidized housing, not affordable housing. And so I kind of get back to the point of, you know, the value, what do they create for $4,300? And it's, they do create a report that talks about the metrics, I guess, of affordable housing. It's presented every year. And so that's great. I appreciate that. But, you know, what does it do? I asked Chris specifically, do you advocate, you know, before the county council when we talk about urban growth boundary issues or comp plan issues, things like that? No, not really. Just we're a resource. And so, again, I don't have a hard time trying to figure out what the function is and how to measure the success of that function. Because I don't, we have another group, Housing Alliance of something, HART, which is
Affordable Regional Task Force.
yeah, which is headed by County Executive Summers. And I would say is probably has a lot more influence than what the AHA does as far as policy issues. And again, for $4,300, I don't know if it's worth it. Well, it's nice to have, but again, it's $4,300, and I just don't know what we get out of it for that work. Yeah, and so I don't, Russ, do you want to make, you know, put you on the spot here, any comments that you have, but you and I have talked about this a little bit previously. And
I would just say that the work product they usually do is general statistics for the county, and they have done workups for each jurisdiction that sort of points to demographic trends and housing needs, et cetera. So just like you said, they do make themselves available to communities, but their real deliverable is that data set.
Is the information that they have in that data helpful in looking at our like housing action plan? Like, is there any, I guess, is there collaboration happening between the AHA and the HART, or the AHA and the development of our housing plan, or are they pretty siloed?
So I know Chris is on the HART, so.
There's information flow then back and forth, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't know that there's any more information that he provides that the county planners don't already provide, right?
It's not like $4,300 gets us some different kind of information that we can get without the $4,300.
No.
So we're not getting any decision-making data. We
Right.
get that from PSRC at the county.
But I will say that Chris's data, and he will say it, supports that you need more inventory
Oh, I didn't know that.
to have affordability.
Yeah.
But that's not listened to by the county planners.
yeah,
Or the builders.
I was hopeful, I think, because when I was on the Alliance for Housing Affordability, the HART wasn't going. So my hope was that there was, you know, that there was some sort of.
I don't, it seems like they're almost a parallel path. It's,
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, they might use Chris's information, but
Yeah.
it's nothing earth shattering.
Yeah.
More inventory provides more affordability.
Maybe
And I-
to complicate your conversation a little bit, now that there's the state legislation that's specifically dealing with housing action plans, and now is shifting this burden from a statewide perspective to jurisdictions, and we will be taking on affordable housing allocations. That's a county-driven process. So there's probably 3 or 4 parallel paths right now. So that is the big question. Where do they all intersect? And so far, nobody's gotten the last one.
And I would say, I mean, the couple of meetings that I have attended, you know, the Everett Housing Authority is a major influence in that committee. And, you know, the Housing Authority, granted, it's about providing housing, but generally market, it's not about providing quote affordable housing for the market. It's more of a subsidized incentive type housing. So, I mean, they are the major contributor to.
Everett
to the
Housing Authority
budget.
or Hasco? Is it Hasco? I think it's Hasco.
Our
Snohomish County.
person is an employee of Hasco,
Okay,
and so they provide a lot of funding. The cities provide, the cities that are party to the interlocal agreement also participate in
Got it.
funding the position.
So anyway, I guess the bottom line is, I mean, we can continue to participate. I just, it's kind of that cost benefit deal. I don't know what we're getting out of it, but it's a small price to pay for being involved. But it's unfortunate that I don't see it gets packaged to talk about. Until we have the inventory out there, we're not going to have affordable housing in this area. We put so many constraints on development activities and such in this county and the state that, good luck. It's not going to happen. So drive over to Marysville and see these retention vaults that are being built on these subdivisions on 87. It is absolutely incredible. You're talking millions of dollars, and it all goes into the price of the house. And that's not the only thing. I mean, there's multitude of things that have increased costs. The bottom line is we don't have enough land to go out and try to mitigate some of these cost impacts. So we're purposely constraining the supply. And I'm sorry, I said it at the meeting, but if density were the answer, Seattle would have affordable housing. Density is not the answer. So
I was at a Chicago title thing today. We are still in a deficit, and we will continue to be in a deficit, even with all the permits that are out there, with the influx of people coming to Snohomish and Pierce County. We're number 1 and number 2 out of 3,000 some odd counties. So like Gary says, it's not going away. It's not affordable unless, and with the UGA being as they want us to go up. And
there's a sauce to do that.
yeah.
Well,
There's a sauce to do that.
I can't remember the exact example, but the idea of in Seattle, they took down like 2 or 3 houses and then built 10 houses of 800 square feet apiece, and they went for 900,000. Like, how does that become affordable?
That's affordable housing. in
That's
Seattle.
affordable
Page
housing in
50.
Seattle, 900,000.
So and that's your typical dadu in Seattle.
Right.
Detached accessory dwelling unit, 1,000 square feet or less,
Crazy.
no parking.
Yeah, and I think the conversation around the whole thing, we lose the definition of affordable housing. It's like, and most of the conversation is actually about subsidized housing. It's not affordable housing, it's subsidized housing, and that they're 2 distinct different things. And the only way you're gonna get more people to be able to live in the areas is subsidized housing. And the government's gonna have to pay for it, or somebody gotta pay for it.
But is that the most efficient way? to do
No, I
things?
didn't say that. I just said the way you do it is subsidies.
there's
I mean,
also there's
we
no
got.
incentive for developers to develop
Exactly.
affordable housing,
Except
right?
subsidies.
Sure. And
That's
even
it.
then, it's not worthwhile. You can't find developers.
Yeah, we can give them a subsidy and then we're gonna legislate it out of there because, well, we just came up with another reason for you not to be able to build right there.
Thank you. I appreciate the information.
I don't know what you want to do, if you want to continue with that group.
I'm a no for it. I'm a no for it. If we're not getting anything out of that, I'd rather put that $4,800 to anything other than that.
I think it would be, I know that Chris has made himself available. I think it would be interesting to have him come here and convince us what benefit do we have to continue being a part of it? I do remember, there were conversations 2 years ago about, I found really beneficial around just getting some similar language from city to city around codes and ADUs and infill and kind of how to have some consistency and, but I also hear what you're saying.
I
like,
don't know
it's-
if Chris gives that information. It's more of a statistics guy.
But maybe it's worth asking him the question.
No, I can reach out to him, and obviously council is going to be getting the information from Burke pretty soon on our housing action plan.
Good.
You'll be hearing about a lot of housing over the next 18 months.
Good.
Okay, we've got our proposed agenda for next week.
November 8th, 2022, we've got an introduction of the person. Mayor's business, we said emergency orders. I have it on there. I think procurement policy is already there, but I wrote it in. Public hearing on storage facilities. Ordinance 1150, first reading of the budget 2023. And we have the ordinance 1149. Property tax. And then we have the continued rezone request. Discussion items, we've got a code enforcement update, which comes for a week or so. We'll have the STR discussion based off of.
So I want some clarification on this continued district rezone request. Who's Christie Schmidt? Am I missing something?
Their senior planner.
Senior planner, okay, never mind.
Should we,
We got too many
in
people.
the name of time next week, should we do the code enforcement update? How long is that going to take place?
I envision that being a department report, so I wouldn't expect more than 5 minutes.
With that.
We can definitely move that out.
You want to move out a week or two?
I think move it out a week or so, like just everything else seems to take us an hour. I mean, each session, so that's why we're here for 3 hours tonight.
Mhm. You're right.
Continue with the emergency orders.
Yeah, let's keep that in place. I know everyone's been going to the grocery store on their designated days.
Oh, I forgot about
I
it.
know. We've been giggling about it all week.
Thank you very much. Right, we are.
Adjourned.
All right.
That was fun.
You got it by 20 seconds. Good job.
Yeah.